Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I'm going to change my hair just so that I look a little bit different from the other video that I just filmed. This video is not about my hair. This video is about the Blend Bunny Cheeks collection. The Bare Cheeks and the Juicy Cheeks collection. They not so recently released these at the time that this video is being filmed. As I have said before, it's been very difficult for me to have the energy to film more than once or twice a week, which puts me very behind what I initially had been hoping to accomplish. So my frustrations aside, we are working with what we can. I am doing my best. And so initially I had planned on doing a full B-roll cheek swatch video so that you could see every single shade being swatched on my cheeks. That's just not going to happen. This video is not as well put together as I was really hoping for, but again, I am really just having to work within my physical limits, and unfortunately, what I want to be able to do right now is escaping what I can do, and I mean, it's better than the other way around, I guess, but both situations still suck pretty bad, so if you've ever been in either or both, then you know exactly how I feel. But we're here to talk about these blush palettes. I get really nervous buying indie palettes. For those who don't know, I used to have the Menagerie Cosmetics Arthurine Blush Palette Volume 1. I did used to have it. I don't have it anymore, and I have never really felt the urge to repurchase it or any of the singles. And initially I thought, oh, maybe I'm just not that good at using blush, I'm a blush beginner, and so that's why I held on to it for such a long time. But even now that I would consider myself to still, even compared to like 1 or 2 years ago, I think my makeup skills have improved a lot if you will like go through my videos, but I still don't think I would be able to use it very well even if I repurchased it now. So I haven't, and I think it is because I realized I just don't really like pigmented blushes. If they're super pigmented, I really have a hard time blending them out, especially because I don't always set my whole face with powder before putting on my cheek products. Sometimes my skin being very dry, I actually will use the blush, the bronzer, and etc. to set my face. So if I'm using a really matte blush or bronzer, I will just use that straight on top of unset foundation. Because of that, indie blushes tend to do this thing where they stick and then you can't blend it out. You have to put it down on an already matte powdered down base, and it just doesn't always agree with me, especially their more vibrant dark colors. And indie blush palettes are also kind of questionable for me because, you know, face palettes in general are a contentious topic, because if a face palette comes out that is for multiple skin tones, then automatically you run into the situation of, okay, well then what's the point of having that many shades in a blush palette? It would be better to have smaller palettes and split it into multiple SKUs, but that's very expensive for indie brands to do. So that is its own topic of discussion, which is why, you know, especially when we're talking bigger brands, there's a lot of push for bigger brands to release multiple SKUs of face palettes because they actually, you know, have the money to do that. Indie brands don't, so I tend to be a little more forgiving of them, but that still leads to the issue of, am I actually going to use every shade? So I don't necessarily know why I bought these, because they should have fallen into that category of blush palette where it's like indie blushes, bright colors, goes from light to dark, not really my speed. So I guess I felt like maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a little, it does kind of seem foolish for me to have bought them, but I had such a great experience with Blend Bunny's matte eyeshadows. I thought that maybe the blushes would kind of be similar, where even if they are pigmented, they'll blend out really easily, because the Blend Bunny eyeshadows, if I put them on top of a set eye base, it actually will blend out so easily that I could completely lose control of the pigment. It just goes everywhere. So I guess part of me thought that maybe the blushes would kind of just be that way, but I was not entirely correct. So spoiler alert, I don't necessarily think these are the greatest blush palettes to have ever landed on the face of this planet, and I'm not as happy with them as I thought I would be. They're not by any means bad though, and last I checked they were like $30 to $32 each or something like that, so for the number of shades you get, which is 8 per palette, it's not really that bad of a deal. So the quality that I got out of it, I'm not really feeling like I wasted my money. These palettes work really well as multi-use eye and face palettes, so I could totally see myself bringing this with me to travel and using this as an eye and face palette, because I will say the shades that I can use in these palettes are legitimately amazing, and the shades I can't really use, I could still see myself using them as eyeshadow. So that's why I think I still ultimately like these. But let me quickly just go over each individual shade one by one. So first off is Juicy Cheeks. This is the one I was the most excited for, because specifically the yellow and the orange. I am still on the hunt for a perfect pure pastel yellow blush. Most yellow blushes still have an element of grunge to them, a little bit dark with a little bit more orange added in, and so they still feel a little bit more like American mustard. This is definitely not the perfect yellow I was looking for, but it is still very beautiful. I actually do have B-roll of me applying some of these shades in this palette. This shade is a beautiful orange, so I do have the shade shade Persimmon from Emma Cosmetics. This is Persimmon, and I do have this shade, but as you can see, I hardly use it because it is just so glowy, and ultimately, I'm just not a glowy blush person, so I have been looking for orange blushes that are matte. Now, the Sem from the Korean brand, the Sem, does have blushes in a multitude of colors, but I just found that they didn't blend that well, and they kind of are a little bit patchy. I don't know. I was not the biggest fan of their quality. They just don't jive with my skin type for some reason. This is so beautiful. This is an absolutely solid color that blends super well, and it's light enough that I don't find it really scares me. So just for these two shades alone, honestly, this whole palette is worth it. So I'm not complaining. This shade here is also very pretty, and then this shade here is something I really like to use in conjunction with this shade. I use this like under my eyes, and then I use this to blend it out, and I get the most fruitiest look ever. But on to the next half. These two shades are really great. I actually really like both of them. This one is a little bit much. But it's not too purple. It's still more of like a very cool pink. So as long as I use a very light brush, then I'm fine. However, these two shades are where I start having problems, and I think I have B-roll of me using this shade. These two shades are so pigmented that if I put them down, even over a set base, I have a really hard time blending these out. I really have to work my brush in. I have to like use the softest brush ever to lay them down, but then I have to use a rougher, denser brush to really try and shift the pigment around on my skin to get a smooth blend. I have to go into other blush shades to blend them out for sure. They definitely don't blend out on their own. So like this shade I use with this shade, or I use, you know, some other blush in my collection. So just for reference, when I'm using those darker blush shades, my favorite brush to use is actually this one from Laura Lee Los Angeles, and you can see it is just so soft and diffused. This is like my favorite brush for ultra pigmented blushes, or if I'm using setting powder and I only want to use a little bit under my eyes. This is such a perfect brush. I actually am hoping that I can find more of these as singles, because I would buy like another 9 of these. I'm not even kidding. So I use this for that, but even then it's just still so difficult for me to lay down the perfect amount of pigment. And then I still have to use something a lot more like rough. Like I have to use like, you know, a natural hair brush like this rougher brush here to really move the pigments around. So they are a little bit high maintenance, it feels like to me. Like I'm really having to work with it, and it's not like it's inconvenient for me to have to use multiple brushes for my blush, but at the same time it's a little bit irritating. It's like I feel like I shouldn't have to do this. Now again, it's not like I paid $100 for this face palette or anything. They are really not that expensive on a per shade basis, but I definitely just felt like, given the prestigious quality of her matte eyeshadows, I felt that her matte blushes would carry some of that with them, and I just genuinely feel like for the darker shades, they just don't. Now again, the darker shades are probably not really meant for my skin tone, but with them all being in one singular palette, everybody should be able to use all of the shades easily. So even though they are definitely much darker than what somebody of my skin tone would usually use, I still feel like they should be at least a little easier than they were to use. Like, I don't want to sound like I'm entitled or anything, because I know those shades definitely were meant more for like people with darker skin than me, but it's in the palette. I can't just buy partial palette, or else I would have. Like if there were multiple face palettes, I would have gotten the lighter one, but because of the fact that there is no dark and light option, I feel like the fact that I'm having such a hard time using the darker shades, I feel like that isn't something that I should let slide too terribly much, because I don't have the option of excluding them. So yeah, and again, the more SKUs you make as a brand, the more expensive it is to get the order in to manufacture and to sell. So oftentimes indie brands are kind of forced to do this because they just can't make that many SKUs. Like this is why you don't really see many indie brands making complexion products like foundations and concealers, because the sheer number of SKUs would just sink most of them. But anyways, so that's the Juicy Cheeks palette. I will say of the two, I like both, but the yellow and the orange in Juicy Cheeks makes the whole palette worth it for me. That's how much I love yellow and orange blush. So I will just put that out there. If you also are a fellow yellow and orange blush lover and you have spent a lot of money trying to find good yellow and orange blushes, if you just bought this, even if you didn't use the rest of the palette, I feel like that's good, because then your yellow and orange blush hunt ends. I mean, unless you're me and you're looking for like that pastel pure primary yellow blush, like that milky yellow blush, this obviously is not that. I'm still looking for that, but I feel like I'm gonna have better luck finding that in Asian and Japanese and Korean brands, which is why I will continue my hunt for it eventually. I just have, the hunt is on hiatus, but I will continue eventually. Probably I'm going to start looking into Chinese brands to find them, but that regardless, I'm going to move on to Bare Cheeks now. Bare Cheeks is okay for me personally, for my skin tone. The only two shades I wasn't able to get around to use yet is going to be these two right here, but I did use every other shade, and this shade, okay, so this shade here, this shade, and this shade do make the entire palette worth it for me, because those three are very unique shades. These are not shades I feel like I see often in the Western blush market. This in particular. So beige blushes had a really huge moment in Korea, which is really cool, but the beige blushes that I see on the Western market all effectively look like bronzers, and they're meant for more of a sunburnt tan look. That's not my vibe. I don't do that. I don't like looking tan. However, the beige blushes in Korea, it's more like it's meant to just kind of be almost like a space filler. It's meant to just fill in space between your eyes and your lips. So especially if you're like me and you have a lot of distance between your eyes and your lips, so you have a long mid face. Those beige blushes are meant to just fill that space in, shorten that distance, fill that emptiness, and they make your makeup look really calm, almost like this cold, mysterious, you know, they've got it together, they know what they're doing, they don't want to talk to you, you can't sit with them kind of a vibe. That's kind of the vibe that the beige blushes in Korea are going for. It's very, very much arm in arm with the mute makeup trend. So to give an example, these just arrived from my YesStyle order from that I placed literally in December. So I haven't actually used them yet, so excuse me for that, but like they just arrived because YesStyle takes forever. Here is a blush from Nemming and Toast. I've been waiting for this shade for so long. I'm so excited to start using it soon. You can see the beige, and a shade like this, it's very, very reminiscent of what I saw when I saw the release for Bare Cheeks. So do you see, aside from the Bare Cheeks one being darker, do you see how they both have a more pink rose milk drop to them as opposed to being warm and bronzy? They've got that element of rosiness versus something that's super warm. So if you are not one to buy from YesStyle, or you're not one to buy like from, you know, overseas, then I think Blend Bunny Cosmetics is going to be the way that you can get your hands on a beige blush that doesn't look like bronzer, that gives you that vibe. And so this shade right here, this is such an amazing shade. I literally have been using this like all the time. Like I just go into this palette just for that beige shade, and I unironically feel like this is worth it, and I'm so happy I have this whole palette just because of the beige shade. Like that's how good that beige shade is. So I just had to simp for that shade for a second. This shade reminds me of that Armani blush that I just got. Very, very pretty. This is actually pretty easy for me to apply and blend. I can actually share it out really well. I cannot say the same for this shade. I have this shade on today, and that shade I was trying to put under my eyes. Oh my god, I put on too much. I hadn't set my face, and it was such a nightmare to blend. I actually had to go into the Flower Nose blush to blend it out, which is why you see I have some pink. I had to use this because I was having such a hard time blending it out even with the other shades in this palette. I just couldn't do it. So this shade, and the same goes for this shade too, by the way. This shade also, it's just so difficult for me to use, and then this shade too. All three of the shades on this darker row, they just don't blend out. They don't want to blend out, and it's really, really frustrating for someone like me. Of course, if you have a darker skin tone, then you can't afford to apply more of it and have it be a little bit more pigmented because it's going to show up really well on you. But for someone like me, having to be able to really finesse the blend, those shades are not forgiving at all. I would have to have like such a set base, or like I have to use other blushes. Like I have to be really careful, and I have to work really hard to make those shades work. And I think that is, it just reminded me of why I don't generally buy indie blushes, because usually, unless I'm buying an ultra light shade from an indie brand, they are just so difficult to use. And the only exception I found for that rule so far has been the Lethal face blushes. I have found that the Lethal face blushes are very, very nice, but like Menagerie was so difficult to use, Blend Bunny is so difficult to use, and even some of the shades in like the Lunar Beauty blush palette were not the best. And then Laura Lee had that Blush Aesthetic palette from way back in the day. I decluttered it. It was so bad. Yeah, I feel like I'm very particular about blushes, So my criticisms for the Blend Bunny cheek palettes are much more because of my skin tone and my personal preference, so make of that what you will. If you love using really deep blushes really intensely, or if you have a darker skin tone so you really need those pigmented darker blushes, you obviously are going to have a really great time with these. Again, these per shade, considering you have 8 shades, price for these I feel is incredibly fair, especially because she does run flash 25% off sales all the time, and you can use codes if you'd like to outside of those, so you can not even have to pay full price for these. So I feel like the pricing on these is fair enough that despite everything that I've criticized, the parts of these palettes I do love so much that I am still happy to have these in my collection. I just will say, if you are the kind of person where you want to use every single shade in a face palette, do consider that these have a fairly large depth range. You may not be able to successfully use every single shade unless you use these as eyeshadow, which is a completely fair thing you can do. I swear these are so pigmented. I feel like these will work really well as eyeshadow. I wish this could be more elegantly edited, but I am trying to do what I can. I really just didn't want to have to push off uploading this any longer. I know I'm not on a time limit. It's not like this is my job, but it just has been hanging over my head for so long and it's stressing me out so much that I think it'll be better for me to just do a good enough job and close the door on this video, as opposed to trying to let it sit around until I think it's perfect. Sometimes I just have to let things be good enough and just let it go. So that's what we're doing with this video. But I still hope I was able to explain things well to you. Now, as for wear time, that is not a problem. All of these shades wore just fine. I honestly, no fading, no nothing. So if you have dry skin, then I think you will be absolutely fine. Again, I have dry skin. Blush does not tend to fade easily on me. So I am sorry I couldn't provide cheek swatches like I had hoped for, but there are other creators out there who did do cheek swatches, such as Steph's Beauty Stash. So I think you guys have plenty of resources for cheek swatches of these if you want to look elsewhere. But I hope that my review helped if you are interested. I personally always use Bad to the Brows code when I order from Blend Bunny Cosmetics because she is one of my favorite creators, and I have spoken with her before online and she is so nice and so funny. So I love to use her code. So I recommend you use her code, which is like Millie10 or something, to get a little bit of percentage off, but use whoever's code you want or don't use a code at all. And yeah. Now, I did apply some setting powder to my cheeks. I applied a little bit more than normal because I do expect these to be pretty pigmented, so I want to make sure I'm able to apply just the right amount of blush. And I am going to go ahead and make sure I use more diffuse brushes. So I'm going to mostly use my Luxie Pro Tool brushes. I just think that these are going to be, they are among the loosest brushes that I have. So I'm going to go into Squeeze, and I'm going to use this first. I do have Persimmon from M Cosmetics. M Cosmetics powder formula is quite glowy, and I honestly have been looking for a while for a matte yellow and matte orange blush. So I did buy these myself. I wasn't sent these or anything, although that would definitely be a dream come true. Really nice, and that did actually blend out really well. I'm glad that I added some setting powder beforehand. So now I'm going to, I want to really echo this pink here. So I'm going to switch to a very small brush right here, and I'm just going to apply a very small amount right under my eye. And this is a very pigmented blush color, so I'm just going to, I'm kind of dabbing off the excess on the back of my hand first. This blush palette definitely is going to be pretty challenging for me to use. I don't really like ultra pigmented blushes. I was really nervous buying this, and I still do feel a little bit intimidated. Okay, so I feel like this shade kind of is sticking a little bit. It's a little difficult to blend, but this is kind of what we're looking like right now. So I am going to go ahead and put this on the other side of my face before I add in any more colors. I'm just barely tickling my skin with this brush to get the initial layer laid down. Okay, so this time did a little bit better by just being very light-handed with how I applied things. Okay, so this is what we're looking like now. I feel very fruity and I love it. So I really want to use the yellow. I think the yellow will really help to brighten everything up and pull everything together. So I'm going to switch to a clean brush and I'm going to go into Tangy. This is kind of a darker yellow. It's not like a true yellow. It still has a little bit of orange to it, but I'm very excited. I'm going to put this more or less just right on the inner part of my face. I think I put it too close to my nose. Oops. I'll use like powder foundation or something to undo that. Alright, so I'm gonna stick it just like right here. This right here is what I was trying to do, a little bit more controlled. And I'm going to use the powder foundation to touch up my little oopsie right here. We'll just use the powder foundation to kind of erase some of that. Sometimes you just gotta erase those mistakes. Okay, so you can see I was able to more or less clear that up. So even with the setting spray down, you can see that the blush is still very, very matte. I definitely was able to get quite the fruity look on my cheeks. Really like how it turned out, so I will go ahead and end this demo here and you'll just move on to the next demo. Alright, we'll see you in the next demo. Okay, so next I'm going to continue to use the Juicy palette and I'm going to test out this shade here. I think I want to mix it and like kind of use this shade and then use this shade as the pop. I'm a little bit nervous, but we'll see how it goes. I'm gonna use these nice fluffy brushes because I know these shades are pretty pigmented, especially Juicy. I'm like kind of nervous, honestly, not gonna lie. So I am going to start off with Ripe and I'm just taking a little bit and I'm just going to use this right underneath my eyeshadow. And this is going to be that shade that links to the rest of the blush. Now this is a really dark shade. I honestly probably would get more use out of this as an eyeshadow, but in this case I think just using it right here in this very precise location, just using a little bit, and it's very similar in shade to the eyeshadow I laid down, so it'll be good to transition from the blush to the eyeshadow. I'm going to be kind of doing something similar to the first B-roll where the blush kind of almost blooms from the eyes. I do really like blush heavy looks like that, so I'm just going to do that again. The first time that I wore it, I had great wear time. It like didn't fade. By the end of the day, my blush looked more vibrant than my eyeshadow, honestly. Nothing to complain about the wear time of these powders. It's just that with how pigmented these are, I used to have the Menagerie Arthurine blush palette and I decluttered it because it was so pigmented and it was so difficult for me to blend. I felt like I couldn't use it. I almost feel like I'm gonna have I feel like I'm having similar experiences with this where it's so pigmented. I have to be so careful. Alright, so I'm gonna go into Sticky Sweet now and I'm just going to start working this kind of closer to the inner part of my face, but not super close to my nose. This isn't necessarily like a lilac or anything, it's a pretty hot pink, and so I'm just gonna start working this as the kind of more point shade. Very bright. It's like a really bright pink. Very, very cool purple based pink. It's definitely not lilac at all though. Which if you know anything about me, then you may know that I've been on the hunt for a perfect milky lavender blush for years now, and I still haven't quite yet found the perfect one, but I've got some pretty good contenders. So this is definitely not going to be in the running, but that's okay. These are ultra matte powders, which is good. I do personally prefer matte blush. Any sparkles you see is just fallout from my eyeshadow. I feel like this shade Sticky Sweet is blending out a lot easier than Ripe did. Yeah, I feel historically whenever I use really dark matte blushes, for some reason they just always end up being so much more difficult to blend. I don't know if it's just like a formula thing, like it's inherent to darker blushes, or if it's just because of the fact that these darker blushes are not necessarily meant for my skin tone, but I always feel like they're not as easy to blend out as lighter ones are, with the exception to that being the Clinique Cheek Pops. Okay, so lastly, I do want to use Raw, which is the shade here. I'm going to use this to just blend everything out and make my face look a little bit more normal. This shade is pretty soft and this brush is extremely flimsy and diffuse. So you can see I'm applying such a thin layer, but it really helps to tone down everything. I should have used this to apply the darker blush. Do you see how that just kind of helps with the blend for everything? This is what that's gonna look like. I did find the darkest shade here to be a little tricky to blend out. I think maybe if I had applied it last, then there would be more mattification going on. It would blend out maybe a little bit easier, or maybe if I had used this brush instead, I'm not sure. I will experiment with using this brush more often. So far so good. So far. I ended up using kind of like a big mashup of blushes. I initially just wanted to use Blend Bunny Bare Cheeks, and I was hoping to just use the shade, I was hoping to just use these two shades here, but I'm gonna have some thoughts on the quality of these pigments. I think this is one of the reasons why I tend to stay away from indie blushes, but I had a really hard time blending it out and everything, so I ended up using copious amounts of this new blush from Flower Nose in the shade Coral Jellyfish, and that really helped to kind of salvage the look. And as you can see, my blush ended up turning out pinkier than I expected, but that's okay. So with that, if you guys have any questions about these cheek palettes from Blend Bunny, you are of course welcome to ask. And other than that, I think I'm gonna sign off. And yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. Bye bye!